numbers and work it out. But it's just extremely inefficient trying to feed that calf through the cow. It also allows us to better allocate our limited feed resources. We're able to sort of put some better quality feed into these calves. And also one of the things is that we know that by early weaning that calf off the cow, that calf will require far less, but it needs to be good quality and energy. But when we're looking at the cow, all of a sudden the cow is getting by on far less energy and protein. The requirement for a lactating cow, we normally talk about 9 megs and 12% protein. Realistically, once a cow's dry, a cow can get by on 7 megajoules and 7% protein. The other thing that we do really look at is it helps to maintain that herd fertility. If we wean early, we get that animal with more time, that cow with more time to recover. So if we look at it in practical terms, and I've been seeing some herds around, some cows have dropped a full fat score, some have dropped a full 2 fat scores. That equates to 70 plus kilograms depending on the animal for that animal to increase the fat score. So all of a sudden we're asking the cow to put on 140 kilos. Unless you've got on brilliant diet, it's very hard for her to get up there quickly unless you give her enough time. So it really is about maintaining that herd fertility. The other thing that we do see, with particularly while we're doing this early weaning, is that we get cows, we get that stopping of the suckling reflex, and all of a sudden we're seeing cows actually come into estrus, start cycling. So it is a good trick to help actually get a few more cows in calf than what we would do normally as well. So we're also able to better utilise high quality pastures. Just in the last few days I've been out and about at one location. This person I was talking to, we were talking about some of the short pick that they've got coming up, because they've been lucky enough to get a little bit of rain, but also the response that that person's been able to get from that loosen on those flats. And all of a sudden, you know, if we were to put the cows and calves into that sort of paddock, it wouldn't last very long. Whereas if we were able to put calves in those high quality pastures, we're going to get some very good benefits. It's going to last a lot longer, they're going to eat far less and perform a lot better. We can also better utilise some of our supplementary food. Some of this cereal hay that we've been seeing about and doing tests on hasn't been adequate in energy or protein for a lactating cow, but all of a sudden that's been fine once we've got a dry cow. The other thing, and this is increasingly more important in some areas, it saves a bit of water. Lactating cow requires more. You split them up, we're seeing an increase or decrease in the amount of water required. But also we get an increase in market flexibility. And even myself, I recently weaned some calves off some cows on my place. And the change in those cows within a week, and now 2 weeks after I've weaned, has been tremendous. I'm now starting to look at quite easily getting some tops out of those cows so I can sell those on. And the calves, they're picking up on reasonable quality feed. So it gives us that marketing flexibility on where we can go, and also the options that we have for those animals. When should you early
Brett, a couple of people have just commented that the sound is not coming through that well for them.
Okay. I might sit a bit closer. Is that better?
That is a lot better. Thanks, mate.
Okay. Is that okay? So when should you early wean? Really, this sums it up. This photo here, we're seeing a cow here that's struggling. We've got a cow that's down in body condition. You can really see the spinous processes along the back line there. We see the concavity in the back end. We're really seeing a cow that's utilised all its fat. It's now into its muscle. Trying to pick that cow up and improve her really is quite a difficult thing while she's got that calf on her. She's done the job to get that calf to where it is now, and really that is the time that we, ideally before we get to here, but this is a real trigger for me now when I'm seeing some of these cows starting to look like this. We should be early weaning at this point. If you are going to early wean, it is very, very important that we feed for growth and not maintenance with these young calves. There's no point feeding for just to maintain these calves. We need them to grow. There's a lot of issues if we don't feed for growth. So it really is about nutrition, nutrition, nutrition when we're feeding these calves. We need to manage them correctly so that we get them growing, get them performing, and get them to critical weights that we're really chasing at certain ages. So for me, you know, as I've sort of said, at 7 months, there's no real benefit for a calf being a cow. But how light can you go? This is one of the questions I've been dealing with in the last few weeks. A lot of it comes down to rumen development and how that calf is travelling. I know I've got 70 kilos here. I know people have been weaning lighter than that. The weights that I will be giving here are guides. Obviously, a 80 kilo European type calf is going to be different to a 70 kilo Wagyu calf or an 80 kilo Wagyu calf. What we tend to find is that really in the first month or so, a young calf is acting more or less like a monogastric. We've got the esophageal reflex bypass, so it's moving through. We're not seeing those calves with a developed rumen as yet, and it is really important that we do have this developed rumen if we're looking at trying to feed them and manage them. Some important points to look at though is that if we are looking at weaning these calves, the lighter and younger they are, the higher the protein and energy that they're going to require. Also, the younger and lighter the calf, the more issues. And you really need to be aware of that, and that's got to be reflected in how you manage these animals. So, younger than 6 weeks, 70 to 80 kilos, it is very, very hard work. I tend to advise people if they're looking at that type of thing and they're not set up in the scenario of having good facilities, if they're not willing to look at milk powder, feeding milk and the like, to think about selling those ones. If we are going to feed them, we can do it. It's a lot of hard work and it does cost money. You're really needing some very, very high quality pellets with good palatable hay. Things like rice, straw and stubbles don't cut it very well with these young animals. The other thing is that we really find with these very young animals that coccidiosis becomes a real big issue, and it is something that, you know, we need to be thinking about as part of our planning. It is also important that we look at delaying marking, branding, dehorning and the like with these young calves. They're stressed. We don't need to add any more stress. We don't need to stack it on top. So really is one of these things I say, you need to delay your marking and branding, hold off, going to have to give them a chance to get a little bit bigger, get them used to being fed, the rumens, work things out a little bit, and then look at, you know, sort of ideal situation. Hopefully we get a break and there's a bit of green feed or some other ways of managing them.
Are you still there, Brett? I've lost you, mate.
Older than 6 weeks, that's sort of 80 kilos. Yeah, One of the things that is very, very important that is the protein needs to be a true protein. So it needs to be something that's derived from either, a protein meal and the like. I'm not a fan, and the research tells us pretty hard and fast that with these young ones that we don't use the likes of urea or sulfate ammonium and things like that. So needs to be a true protein, and we really need the energy to be up around about that 12, 13 megs of energy. Once again, you've got the option to sell these type of calves, but you can feed these calves. You can feed them a high quality pellet and roughage, but have a look at the label. Have a look at what level of protein it has. Is it using urea to lift that protein concentration up or not? We can use products like DDG, which is dried distiller's grain. We can use protein meals and hay, and also I've seen producers use distiller's syrup, corn lick syrup, and the like to good results in these scenarios. But those bottom ones, they can be a bit expensive. Well, a lot of these things are very expensive at the moment, but they can be more expensive. Distiller's syrups are roughly around about 42% dry matter. So when you sort of start to work it out on a cost per tonne basis, it can run up the value pretty quick. So there's sort of some of the options that you do get with that, but definitely have a look at some of the labels on some of these feeds. But if you're looking at making up your own mix, really that needed up around about that 18-20% protein and 12 to 13 megs. Older than 12 weeks, things get a lot easier. Really, we're seeing, ideally, I'd like them around about 16% protein and down to about 11.5 ME. Our management gets a lot easier. We've got more options with them. Also, you can sell these, but also, managing these animals and moving them forward, it's far easier. We can get by with a grain and roughage. We can get by with fortified molasses mixes. Any of the other ones that we've talked about, it is relatively easy. So there's sort of the steps that I sort of talk about. Bear in mind the numbers of weights that I put there are a guide. Really, what we tend to see in these types of seasons is that, with these calves sort of starting to eat earlier, we're seeing them get a little bit more room and function earlier on. So sometimes we will see. Also, I was reminded the other day when I was out at a place, there were some few very light calves that were pod gutty, and sort of obviously been doing it pretty tight. They're only 50 to 60 kilos, but those type of calves really, I know, do respond to being fed with that DDG or a protein meal and things like that. Start to feed that rumen, start to feed it, get it working. One of the things, and I've been covering it a little bit here, is the protein. It is very, very important in these young calves that we do have adequate levels of protein. We do use true sources of protein, so we either use a protein meal or legume grains and the like. It's very important for their appetite. It's very important for health and their immune function, and it's also very important for their growth and development. If we do not have adequate protein in those feed mixes or in the products you're buying to feed them, it is a long way out bringing these calves up, getting them moving, and trying to keep them healthy and keep them well. If we go to the trouble of early weaning and trying to do the job on them, experiences have taught me that really the protein level is extremely important to ensure that we're getting good results and not poor results. In saying that, one of the things that past experience has taught us, and we know, is that really bypass protein is something that's very important with some of these very young animals, particularly in that under 100 kilos, it is something that I do really recommend that people think about what they're actually feeding. A lot of the feeds that we do, the cottonseed meal, soybean meal, and canola meal and the like that we see, do have a fair degree of what we call bypass protein. It's a more efficient form of protein. It's, as it sort of says, it's bypassed the rumen, goes into the abomasum and into the small intestine, and is used up there. It's a great way to feed these young calves, give them enough adequate protein so that we do get this growth and development of these young calves. I know with some of the mixes that we have been seeing and some people have been putting together, they're getting away with some of these light carbs feeding these bypass protein meals and the like, and that's really why some of these calves are performing a lot lighter than what we'd sometimes recommend. So definitely is something to put in there. Even things like some of our legume grains have a degree of bypass. Lupins, 25% of its protein is naturally bypassed. Field peas 25 and fava beans 10. So is out there. With these pellets and the like, it's with these legume grains, it is very important to process them. Lupins are about 20 to 30% better cracked than they are whole fed to calves. You get less wastage and the like. But it is one of these ones that you need to be a bit careful that you don't over process. On the bottom left hand of the screen is a photo that I took a few years ago now, and although it looks like flour, that was described as cracked lupins. And we actually ended up getting acidosis with the calves that were being fed that. It had been over processed, very fine particles. There's enough free carbohydrates in there to actually cause the problem. So be a bit careful how we look at our processing, but look, definitely with the lupins and the like, they only need to be fractured, they don't need to be crushed up. If we are looking at making our own mixes, the grains really need to be processed with the exception of oats. We'd either want to roll it, hammer mill it, or another option if we're only dealing with smaller numbers or you're set up to do it is actually tempering, wetting that grain down overnight, cuts some of the risk out slightly, but also increases the utilisation. When we're looking at oats, and this got brought back earlier on in the year, it's very, very important that we do look at what oat varieties we're actually using. I had a producer early on the year that had stock that we're only putting on at sort of roughly around about 0.4 of a kilogram a day. Test looked good, everything came back reasonable, couldn't sort of think about it. Asked the guy, I said, what variety? And it came back as a high whole lignin content variety, so making it less digestible and really explaining the lack of performance. The other thing when we're looking at some of our oat varieties, there's some of the oats that we know test up very, very well. The likes of Yarran, Yidda, Yarabi and the like all test very good. The other thing, while I'm just talking on grains, it is common opinion that wheat's more risky than barley and the like, and we know that barley will tend to have a lower starch concentration than wheat. This year, with some of the tests that I've been getting back, I'm finding quite a lot of barley testing up just as high as some of the wheats, around about 70% starch concentration. So need to be still aware in how we're handling them, but it's very important that we don't over process these grains. In saying that, sorghum grain is one. I'm not a fan in any way, shape or form of sorghum grain in early calf mixes. I've had producers do it. It tends to be easily over processed. We end up with a lot of fractures, a lot of fines. We also find that the sorghum tends to bind up a bit of its protein, so it takes a lot more additives to lift that protein up higher. So really steer clear of it if you can. If you have to use it, then really be careful. If you do get a feed test, you'd need to bump up a couple of % on the protein of other things to lift it up, because we do know that you know, it tends to bind some of that protein with the condensed tendons. So the other one is the additives. You know, limestone salt, you're going to need that, and it's very important to make sure you've got that. But also you've got other options of looking at things like some of the buffers that we can use. There are some out there, particularly if we're doing very early wean calves, that are good for things like coccidiosis and the like, but definitely some out there that we can help sort of add to mixes to improve the palatability, reduce some of the dust in some additives, some respects. But feed test. You really need to get a feed test. I know we get a lot of different samples out there. We tend to deal with averages. We see some big variations in some of the feeds that we've seen, and even this year in our own region here, I recently did a wheat sample that came back at 13.3 megs of energy, but the crude protein was 17.4. So vitally important to get a feed test, and so that we know exactly what we're dealing with, and that we're able to meet those minimum numbers that I talk about, the energy and protein that I need for the given weight categories. With a lot of people, it's been far easier for them to get into pellets, and I've been saying to people now, if you're planning on early weaning and you don't have the gear to make up a mix, or look at sort of what pellets you can actually get out in the market, put your name on a list, because you're going to have to do that. Some of the usual sources that I would normally recommend have closed their books. So it is important that you do plan, but you also know the advantages and disadvantages of pellets and nuts. Really, the ease of use is one of the good things. Sometimes they're sold as a complete feed, and I know there's a product currently coming over from the West that they're talking about a complete feed. Even with these young calves, they need a degree of effective fibre. We need a good roughage source. They also say they're a balanced ration. I had an example earlier on in the year where a consultant rang me and he said, this is what's going on, this is what's happening. I went in and had a look at what was in there, and it didn't have enough lime to actually fix the calcium phosphorus ratio. But you know, sometimes they definitely are a better option, and sometimes they are balanced quite well. They've also a lot of the times do have some of the room modifiers in there already, but also they can utilise some poor quality components into their mix. Some of the disadvantages is definitely an acidosis risk. I have seen just recently some real palatability issues with a couple of different mixes. We also see some digestibility issues with some of them, but we also get a powdering. I saw, you know, after they've been put into a truck, augured again in some cases, we're seeing some of them really powdering up. Also, just recently, and talking to some of the vets that I've been working with, we've seen the need to remind people that a lot of the pellets are being made from the available material that they can get and source. And as things are becoming more difficult, they're having to chase different things to put into their mixes. So it is very, very important that you shandy over between loads, and you just don't go, I've been buying and feeding this one type of pellet, everything's been good, I've got another load of exactly the same pellet, and it happened to a producer recently and it did cause a whole heap of issues. So shandy over slow and steady wins the race. They tend to be sometimes a bit higher cost per unit of crude protein and ME, but do your sums and look, sometimes they're definitely a lot easier rather than trying to make up some of your own mixes. In doing this, and when we're sort of getting them into the stage where we're actually looking at that early weaning and managing them, it is important. The basics don't change. We look at some of the rules that we got. If we're looking at weaners, single-sided access, they need 30 centimetres per head. It doesn't change. Double-sided, we get away with 15. It's important that you do have enough space and room for them to get in and around that. Self-feeders, I know I was talking at an event yesterday, and there's currently some companies out there saying you can get away with this many animals around. Our feeder's different to the others. No, the rules don't change. 5 to 7 centimetres per head. So really, it is a hard and fast rule. We tend to see issues come about when people try to short-change this and cut down on the length of trough or the amount of self-feeders that they've got. Silo feeders, we tend to find you can get a few more around them, and that's just basically because you've got heads poking in rather than shoulders being on each other. So as a practical side of things. Big thing that I talk about is like with like. It's one of these ones, and I talk about in the photo on the bottom right hand side is a classic. This is a producer that I did some work with during the 2000s, and you can really see, they're all peas in the pod. They're all very similar size and weight, but the way I try to determine it's like putting a prop against a halfback and trying to see who's going to get the food or who's going to get a meat pie in my case. And it's very hard for a little calf to compete with a big calf. They just simply won't compete. And if you compound that by having not enough trough space and not enough feeders, we really, really find it a big issue. The other thing is plan marking. Ideally, if I am looking at early weaning these calves, excluding those very, very light calves, I really like to have my weaning and marking done at least 2 weeks before I put them in. It just gives them a chance to get over it. There's definite advantages if we're looking at marking calves of castration with a ring versus a knife. People have got their own preferences. If you're using rings very early on, that's well and good, but just remember with the rings, I know in past years we've had issues where animals that used with rings will go wound there for longer, they're a bit more uncomfortable for longer and the like. So plan your marking, think about how you're going to do it, how you're going to move the head. Lighter they are, the smaller the mob. It is important that we really look at our mob size. Ideally, I don't like going over 100 in a mob. If I've got very light calves, then I obviously like a lot less. Shy feeders and sick, pull them, they need to come out and sort of be managed separately, a bit extra TLC, or they're the ones with your shy feeders that you look at selling. I've got the photo down there, and look, this is a photo I grabbed from ex-colleague of mine, and I put it in here just basically to remind myself to talk about overhead hay racks. They might be fine and dandy in other situations, but in an early wean situation, they are trouble. You are asking for problems with overhead hay racks. I'm seeing a lot of them around on places, and really, if you look at the practicalities of it, a calf going in, putting its head up in and into that hay, grazing above its head, is causing a lot of grass, seeds, dust, crud to fall down into the eyes, into the nose, they really are a big issue and something I really avoid. If you are worried about the degree of waste, then I suggest, you know, some of those waste not hay feeders, the ring around ones, or the best of the lot are the ones that have got the sides that move in as the animals graze. They are my preference. If you are, you know, in that situation, I really am not a fan of overhead hay racks. I can't stress that enough. Set up a hospital pen, you know, so that you can give those a little bit of TLC. Your shy feeders, I've mentioned them before, but, you know, have a look at the mob, find them in the mob, pull them out and manage them separately. Look at your correct ration formulations, making sure that you are able to meet that minimum energy and protein. Look at some of your buffers. One that I haven't talked about are some of the low-risk feeds, the likes of some of your pulses. They're very, very useful, but you know, we're seeing some of these pulses come around at the moment, and people are thinking that they're safe like lupins. No. So something like lentils, for instance, we know that they're roughly 45 to 50% starch, so they don't have that safety. One of the big tips that I would give people is careful feeding introduction management to avoid acidosis. Slow and steady wins the race. If you can't get them on slow and steady, then you need to look at the buffers, and including those buffers. Obviously, one of the best of the lot is escalin, but you've got to get that from a vet, and then you've got other things coming behind. Shade is one that I also talk about, and sort of managing those animals. But shade is fine, but it needs to be high. It needs to also be above them and not on the side of them. We know, and we've seen issues really with shade where it breaks that wind. They need that airflow through to help cool them down. So if you're looking at shade and setting up sort of an early weaned area, think about shade, but also think about airflow. It's important that the wind is able to move through. In saying with that, dust control. You know, look at the numbers that we're putting in these areas to sort of minimise some of that dust. I know we sort of talk roughly for those light calves of about 2.5 metres per head can help. Once they're getting up big and heavier, we talk about 4 metres. But have a yarn to someone, talk about what the recommendations are, but they tend to be the general rules of thumb that we talk about. But if we can control that dust, it really goes a long way to help. Splashing a little bit of water around the yard to start off with, minimising some of that dust, can really pay dividends. Water. Now, this keeps on coming up, and during the 2000s we had multiple issues with bladder stones, with some of the pellets that were being fed. We had a few little hiccups at different bits and places. Nearly half the time when I got involved, water was tied up in the issues to a certain extent. It needs to be cleaned. It needs to be cleaned regularly. We need those troughs cleaned. The other thing I would say is, and I'm starting to see a lot more of them about, it's crept over from the sheep side of things, but we're seeing them now in the beef side of things, small volume troughs. These small volume troughs in the middle of summer, they heat up, they get hot. Try to think of it yourself. Would you like a glass of hot water or a glass of room temperature water? I know which one I'd prefer to drink. And really, if they're not drinking, they're not eating. If they're not eating, they're getting sick. So it really is important that we do look at how we manage that. The other thing that we need to look at, particularly with the early wean calves, is the height. Talking to a vet yesterday from up Queensland, and you know, we were talking about some of the pros and cons of the weaning. One of his real practical examples, and you know, it's really good, is height. Some of these cattle troughs are designed for older and bigger animals, and we're really seeing some of these smaller calves having trouble getting in there. So you may have to look at trying to alter in front of your trough that they can actually get up and get their head into it. Also looking at sort of, if you are cleaning it regularly, getting that water out of the yard so that we don't end up with real boggy areas. The other thing I do look at is feed further away from the water. Don't just, have the feed right next to the watering area. It's important that we do have them spread apart a little bit. Some of the health things, look, talk to your vets in your local area, but for me, my practical experience has taught me it's vital that we look at drenching these things. It's vital that we vaccinate them. We get those vaccinations in. We're changing the diet around. We know in some years that we do get AD&E issues, and I know talking to some of the vets that there's been issues out in some locations without any green feed with these early wean calves. I know during 2002-3 I saw quite a few cases of clinical vitamin A deficiency, the night blindness side of things. The thing that we've got to remember before we're getting those clinical signs is that we're getting an appetite suppression. We're starting to get, a nasty little circle start to come in. I look at a vitamin A D&E injection as a insurance policy. If they've had no green feed, haven't seen green feed, then it is important to put it in there. Look at fly control. I know experience has taught me that trying to control the flies is very important, but the likes of a Easy Dose or Swish or one of those products on the back works wonders for keeping the flies off. But it is very important when you do apply it that you actually put it up onto the pole of the animal so it's getting up close to the head. The other thing, and I've been doing some workshops lately where we've been looking at BRD. It's definitely one to think about, and how to minimise that risk. We know it can be an issue in some places, and we see it some years, we don't see it in others. So once again, have a yarn to a vet, talk about sort of those type of options. If you do start to look at sort of the rumen modifiers, the ionophores and the like, ionophores, there's a couple out there that are really good for controlling things like coccidiosis and the like. But have a yarn to someone. Some of the rumen modifiers or some of the buffers, this is more a buffer, really with the early weaning situation, things like sodium bentonite, I'm not the biggest fan in the world of it being in a mix. Limits intake, a few other little bits and pieces, so I'd tend to leave some of them out. But have a yarn to a vet, have a yarn to someone like myself who can guide you with where to go. Some really big things, site location. Past history has taught me that site location, it may all well and good be in a good year, but once we get to some of those bad years, wet seasons where we get a storm event come through, site location's vitally important. Look at, can you actually get in and feed it? Talking to a producer yesterday who's going to put the feeders in the middle in a location that I actually know in some weaning yards, and I said to him, no, set it up on the side so that you can actually feed into it, because once it gets wet in those yards, it's going to get very hard to get in and fill up those feeders. So have a look at your location, have a look at how you're going to set it up. Do you have all-weather access? Is it close to your facilities? Is it close to your yards? Very important. Big thing is, don't set and forget. You need to be going down and monitoring these animals, finding the shy feeders, finding that one that's burying itself in the middle of the mob so you can't see it, that's starting to get sick, and pick them out and pull them out. Monitor performance. You need to be actually weighing those animals, looking at how they're going. We can do it a few ways. We can look at intake, other bits and pieces, but really we need to monitor the performance of them. If you missed it, here's it again, get a feed test. Very important. Get help designing a ration if you're having trouble. I will show you a couple of ways that people can do it. And look, I haven't really covered it much here, but there are pros and cons with self-feeders and troughing. With troughing, we know what we're giving. If we have an issue, we can change things pretty quickly. With self-feeders, yeah, we're not being in there as much. We're not having to play around. But if we make a duff up with a mix, it's a lot of hard work to fix things up. So there are pros and cons with both of them, but definitely, you know, something for producers to weigh up. But it's important that you have enough self-feeders and enough troughing. In saying that, a couple of little tips that we keep seeing is the likes of creep feeding is a great way of minimising some of these issues. I know I'll promise someone to send them some photos of my creep gate setup. I haven't done that yet. Something simple, like in the top left-hand corner there, fairly simple yard. I've made up my own creep feeding gates. It's just inch pipe, made up the frame, but then I've used pipe clamps to hold the verticals. That way I can move it in and out according to the size of the calves as they grow. The one thing that I've got on mine that isn't seen on these photos is a horizontal bar. And talking to a guy yesterday, he was talking about the issues that they've run into with having to cut a couple of cows out of a couple of creep feeders. So really, you know, fairly simple, old technology. It's been around for a long time, but it is very useful in these conditions. Creep feeding, we get calves and lambs eating quicker. We get less shy feeders with it. And look, a producer I was talking to recently said, look, you know, he said, if I've got calves that have been creep fed, he said, I don't get shy feeders. So it really is a useful thing. It now enables you to use that limited resource better. So the likes of that, you know, talking to that lady yesterday, talking about that loosened paddock, it's an option there to set up a creep gate for those calves to go in and out, get them bigger, get them heavier earlier. So therefore they're more saleable and marketable. This is definitely the year to be thinking about that if you've got trying to get animals up a little bit heavier earlier. One other thing that I didn't cover is when I was talking about the mob size, the 100 and the like, and probably one of the big things that I would say is that at the moment, you know, stagger your weaning, particularly with producers with bigger numbers. If they don't have the setup to have those big numbers, to have smaller numbers, and you're stuck with having, you know, sort of 200-300, very important that you do have enough trough space, but very important that you don't go disrupting their social group too much. If you're trying to do that, if you're in the scenario where you've got to bring animals in, don't mob mix once you've started the early weaning process. Don't all of a sudden keep introducing new animals from outside into that mob. You're really disrupting their social pattern. You're causing issues when you start feeding, and it is something that you know, is probably best avoided. But in saying that, I definitely, my ideal situation, and you've seen the difference in the quality of feed, try to wean that tail off. Another option is to take a lead out of a mob. Get rid of that lead. Those bigger, heavier ones, wean them, go through the process. You can wet and dry your cows, and you know, put a little bit extra nutrition into those cows with calves on them, and then sort of do a second weaning. So some of the options that you can do. This is a very useful tool if we're looking at sort of trying to make up our own mix. Down the bottom, it enables you to actually make up your mix, and you can look at the proportions that you put in. So it's one I use all the time. I still use it now, and it is very, very handy. Or you can use the drought feed calculator, and you're doing that as well. So think about those numbers we talked about, you know, that 18% protein, you know, 12 megs of energy and the like. Do you have enough there? But get your feed test to confirm what it is. Finally, the season will change, and we're going to learn from our experiences. This is one experience I learned from myself this year. the cows definitely found the hay that I'd kept for my sheep more palatable than the hay I'd kept for them. And it's amazing how much damage 3 hours a mob of cows can do in your feed pen. But more importantly, in future, I will have 2 chains on the goat, not 1. Thanks, Todd.
Great stuff, Brett. Thanks, mate. That was a very comprehensive rundown of early weaning. A couple of questions here for you, mate. One is, are you targeting any specific weight gains in these early wean calves? I know 06, 07 drought, it was common for extension people to say, oh, you need to get that 0.6, 0.7 kilos a day. Do you think you need quite that high?
Mate, if you're not doing half a kilo a day, you're asking for problems.
Okay.
So that's my absolute bottom. Ideally, I want that 0.6, 0.7, but really, if you're dropping below that half a kilo a day, practical experience tells me it's leading into something not real good.
And I've got a question here from Central Queensland, and Charles is having trouble accessing high protein meal, and he says, well, maybe he needs to do the numbers because he feels it might be still more cost effective to feed the calves through the cows because of the cost of these really high protein meals.
Yeah. So the numbers on doing it are pretty easy. We know a lactating cow requires 60% more. We know the efficiency through the rumen, and then it's all well and good while they're very young. Once they start to get a bit of age, that's really around about that 3 or 4 months, the efficiencies break down. They're no longer milk. They've gone on to the hard diet, but 60% more to feed that cow. You then have a look at the fact that the energy concentration that you need, energy and protein that you need to feed that is just so much more. Even though some of these protein sources are getting pretty hard to get, and we know that there's things like palm kernel meal and stuff that's in and about at the moment. 17% protein, it's on the edge of where you'd want it to be. It's very hard work. I know also probably cottonseed at the moment. I'm not a fan of feeding cottonseed to these early wean calves. I generally won't tell people to put it near them till they're over about that 120 kilos. So it's not an option. You don't need that extra oil to that mix and sort of cause a few little issues. So look, I could do the sums, but I've done them a lot, Todd, and invariably it's always cheaper and easier to split them than try to feed them together.
Great, thanks, mate. Patty has mentioned that she couldn't make it to the webinar, but she has some calves between 1 and 3 months old, and she has some oats and lupins on hand, and basically wants to know a way forward. So it sounds like there's a bit of variation in age between 1 and 3 months, so maybe weaning off the older guys.
Yeah, definitely. Look, if we can get those calves just 2 weeks older, it's going to be a lot easier. So take the head off. If they don't have the facility to crack and process that grain, with lupins, I use the word I have, producers that I've been working with have had good success by soaking it overnight and minimising that waste. Sort of a 30% lupins, and depending whether it's Albus, which is the flat one, or the narrow leaf lupins, they tend to have different proteins. 25 to 35% lupins with the oats, I'd expect good results.
Great, thanks, mate. What about the oats? I mean, we often hear that you don't need to process oats for older cattle. Are you happy with whole oats for these early weaned calves, or would you prefer to see them cracked where possible?
Oh, look, depends on the variety a little bit, Todd. Definitely ask the variety question. Find out which variety they are. Are they a high lignin variety or not? Very important. But yeah, look, if I'm dealing with those calves under 100 kilos, then I would prefer it processed some degree. You know, rolled if you could. Yes.
Where can we find out what these high lignin varieties are?
It's in the Winter Crop Sowing Guide. DPI have got it. I know Peter Matthews is a great resource when it comes to asking individual varieties, and I know they've been doing some stuff in it.
Yeah, thanks, mate.
Peter Matthews from DPI, yeah.
And so these early weaned calves, so let's say you can get them through to that 6 or 8 weeks and you can put together a good ration. How much are we expecting these calves to eat? So for people that are trying to put together a budget.
Yeah, look, if you're going to limit their intake, then really they're going to need roughly around about 2% of their live weight. And that's at that 1.5–2% with those energies and proteins, I'd expect half a kilo. So at 1.5, go to 2, you're going to pick them up a little bit more. So that's a general rule of thumb, about that 2% of their live weight.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Also had a question about DDG, and is there a balance of nutrients and in DDG compared to whole grain? So are you happy for, say, on these young calves for the grain component of the ration to be entirely DDG?
Very happy. As you know, I've had a long experience with them. Last year after the St Ivan's fire, so there's now 2 forms. You've got your powdered form and you've also got your pelletized form. I ended up with some very early weaned calves out of the fire. I brought them home and fed them just the DDG powder and and some hay, and those calves performed very well. In 2009, I had one producer that early weaned down calves to 69 kilos. There was 800 odd calves. He just fed them the DDG with hay. Not an issue. You wouldn't recognise them as the same calves down the track. So yes, but in saying that, you've got to make sure you water, they're drinking it. They are minerally out of whack, so you do need to add your limestone salt, but they've got to drink as well. Definitely important.
Yeah, thanks, mate. Look, a couple of questions here that might be along the same kind of lines, and one is how do you tell if a calf's rumen is working, and at what age does non-protein nitrogen such as urea actually become useful for these calves?
Look, there's been a little bit of work done, not enough really on that degree, but side of things, but really I'd prefer them up a bit heavier, sort of well over the 130, 140 kilos. We know you won't get the benefit out of urea that you will out of a true protein source, but that tends to be, sort of a bit of a rule of thumb. How do you know if the rumen's developed? Yeah, that's a difficult one. Are they eating? What are they eating? And if they're under 4 weeks, we know it's not. And that's it. Really, we know that they're starting to, the esophageal reflex really falls down around about that 3 months. You do get it before that a little bit, and it's going to be dependent on quite a few things, but they tend to be the hard and fast rules.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned it before, like it's very important to monitor your herd, Brett. So basically, if mum has got no milk and the calf is surviving, then it's obviously eating something. And if you're feeding those cows, and just see if the calves are feeding alongside mum, would be a pretty good indication of whether the rumen is working, I would imagine.
Yeah, definitely is. And look, the other thing, Todd, that we probably didn't talk about is, if you're seeing those calves get in and put their head down, you've been feeding them in this drought situation. Things are a lot easier when you go to wean them, particularly if you can introduce some of the things that you're thinking about feeding them in once you lock them up. They all of a sudden don't get the novelty effect and don't shy away from some of the feeds we try to bring in. So if you're looking at the pellets, introduce a little bit of pellets into what you're feeding, so they at least know what it is.
Thanks, mate. Mate, you might have mentioned this in vaccinations, but how successful have you been seeing the pink eye vaccination working in your area, at least?
Yeah, it's one of those big variation ones that we see around about the place. If you're going to use them, you want to have it set up well and truly before you do get to a pink eye type situation. So that's very important. Practicalities, and I'm being very careful here, it's about 50-50. That's as nice as I've seen it work really well in some situations, and I've seen it fall over in others. So and a lot of that comes down to which of the strains are actually of the virus that are running around there, and the like. I think if you're going to use the vaccine, you still need to use good dust control measures. You still need to ensure you're keeping flies under control and the like. It covers a few, it doesn't cover them all.
Yeah, great advice. Thanks, mate. Look, there was a couple of other comments here, and so people have asked, what is bypass protein? What does BRD stand for? What does DDG stand for? So, look, I have answered those, and I've sent out the replies to all. So hopefully people have understood that, but I guess we'll go over it again. So what is bypass protein, Brett?
It's just protected protein that moves through the rumen, isn't used by the bugs, goes into that mason and is used. It tends to be the more efficient form it is the more efficient form of protein. And used in that mason, small intestine, the animal uses it directly. It isn't being used by the bugs in the gut. So we talk about bypass protein or protected proteins.
Yep, no, that's great. There was a couple of questions, and you did address it already, but maybe you'd like to recap. So what is BRD, and, on the whole, is it worthwhile vaccinating for BRD?
Look,
Bovine respiratory disease.
Yeah, bovine respiratory disease, sorry. And look, it's a very complicated topic. I know I've been with vets the last few days, have been talking about and the pros and the cons and the different bits and pieces, and we know it's a huge problem in the feedlot side of things. We also know that there can be some maternal effects with some of these early wean calves as to how effective the vaccine, depending on which ones they are, et cetera, et cetera. It's a very complicated subject, but look, I think if you've had some of the snotty nose respiratory issues in the past, it's definitely something that you need to be thinking about. And particularly if they're early weaned, it's not going to, sometimes for that little bit extra cost, some of the vaccines, and talk to a vet, ask them what they've seen. It can be really worthwhile, because we know if they do get some of the respiratory diseases, that it has lasting effects for their whole of their life. So, if you're going to feed them, do them right, everything else like that, then it's probably something you should be thinking about. Should I or shouldn't I talk to someone and talk about the different products that are out there, because there are a number of them.
Yeah, thanks, Brett. Great advice. Look, several comments here saying that people found this really valuable, enjoying it, enjoyed the information. So thanks so much, Brett.